Catherine Frazee is Professor Emerita at, soon-to-be renamed, Ryerson University, where prior to her retirement she served as Professor of Distinction in the School of Disability Studies. The Chief Commissioner of the Ontario Human Rights Commission from 1989 to 1992, Dr. Frazee has written extensively on human rights, precarious citizenship, and the activist resistance of disabled people.
Greetings from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory, known by many as Nova Scotia, is neither new nor Scottish, as its common name suggests, but instead consists of lands to which the Mi'kmaq people hold rightful title, affirmed in the treaties of peace and friendship. I am a grateful settler on these precious lands, and I cherish the threads that connect me to all of the life that struggles here and flourishes here, and all that has come before me, and all that will follow. In that same spirit of gratitude and humility, I offer my contribution to this forum, knowing that I am neither entitled nor robustly qualified to speak about what does or does not happen at the margins of social inclusion. You see, I am a straddler. As much as my disabilities are obvious and significant, so too is the armor of unearned privilege that has afforded me a good and long and comfortable life. Race and class have eased my way in life, and so you must calibrate whatever I report from the experience of disability, gender, and sexual orientation against that metric. And for my part, I shall try to stick to what I know. I know for starters that my voice is the voice of an old white woman from a generation of boomers who have much to answer for. History will judge my generation harshly for our naive embrace of colonial and neoliberal projects, and for our factless gestures as awareness of the entrenchments of inequality too slowly and dimly dawned. That judgment will be as it should be, and I shall not squander my remaining days in this struggle to plead for history's mercy. Instead, I shall introduce you to my people, the people of disabled country. We are everywhere, of course, our borders fully porous. We are with you and among you, and often just outside your gates. We are sometimes visible and sometimes not, sometimes passing for non-disabled, sometimes hiding in the shadow of stigma. We are rich and poor, gay, straight, queer, two-spirit, and non-binary. Our roots are indigenous, migrant, and settler, descendants of slavery, the Holocaust, diaspora of wars, persecution, and climate catastrophe. Our lives are woven through the entire fabric of pluralism. We are creative and generous and sexy and pissed off, and the list goes on, but you don't need to hear all of this from me, because you've had that awareness training, and that's not my shtick. It's International Human Rights Day, so let's not mince words. The introduction that I will make is a little more urgent, and perhaps just a tad more grim. The people of disabled country are at war. Like many of you, we are besieged by forces of annihilation, toxicity, incarceration, and deprivation. All of these occurring in plain sight, all under the guises of compassion, austerity, and oh so sensible regulatory protocols. We are the castaways of unfettered industrial practices, many of our bodies ravaged by ruthless exploitation and poisoned waste, until becoming no longer productive as workers or profitable as consumers. Those of us who dare to petition for entry to Canada from offshore are unceremoniously rejected at the border in accordance with unjust laws that deem us as burdens to a private healthcare system. Those of us who dare to reproduce live in the shadow of a perpetual threat of being judged unfit to parent, our children whisked away for their own protection. Those of us who are blessed with decent housing, just like those of us who are not, are but one stroke of the bureaucratic pen from being forcibly extracted from our homes and neighborhoods and dispatched to some remote gulag where the basic needs of our bodies will be attended to as our spirits and our humanity slowly but surely perish. And unkindest cut of all, those of us who surrender to any or all of these atrocities, or who submit to sheer despair in the face of deprivation, isolation, and entrenched antipathy toward our kind, we are now offered a very nice and kind and free of charge death by euthanasia, should we so choose, a special state program exclusive to the people of disabled country. Did I mention that we are pissed off? The politics of disabled country, like other movement politics, are formed by our history. That is a history of state neglect and institutional eugenics, of brutal incarceration, exile, abuse, experimentation, and erasure. It is a history with some very dark corners, but a history that has fueled passionate uprisings, large and small. Sometimes our resistance has been as simple as holding on to a shred of colored ribbon as a marker of personhood in carceral settings where everyone wears the same ill-fitted, interchangeable gray tracksuit. Sometimes it is as diabolical as the handshake of a triple amputee who will not release her very firm grip until a recalcitrant justice minister chooses between making a spectacle of himself or giving his word that her people will have their place in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. There have always been bright spots in those dark corners of history, for the cultures of disability, I assure you, are alive with feist and ingenuity. But lest I paint too rosy a picture of what we bring to the Solidarity Project, let me acknowledge that, like the history that we are steeped in, the people of disabled country must now reckon with long-standing inclinations that are racist, sexist, stubbornly middle-class, colonial, and xenophobic. Those processes of reckoning are often too slow and half-hearted. This is on us, all of us, and you must call us out, and we must hear you out until it hurts enough to force meaningful action. So those are a few things I know about the people of disabled country. Now, what do I know about us, the people of Solidarity Forum? Well, very little, actually. Whatever bodies you inhabit, whatever histories situate you, whatever knowledge you carry, I do take it as given, since we are all here at a human rights forum, that we share a common commitment. A commitment that causes each and every one of our hearts to break as one whenever some new victory is scored by the forces of domination, deceit, and greed that imperil us all. That shared and sacred commitment finds expression in the ways that our scarred and battered hearts, abhorring surrender, still swell and roar for justice, and quiver again as one heart in anticipation of a radical new era where the dignity of all living beings is cherished and preserved, and where history itself is rightly honored for its teachings and its warnings. Now, to speak to such an assembly as a devotee of equality and justice to a human rights-themed assembly, that perhaps is a classic case of preaching to the choir, except that the metaphor fails, doesn't it, in one critical respect. Despite our deepest affinities, despite our virtuosities, or perhaps partly because of them, this choir does not appear to have learned yet how to sing together. Which brings us to the project of solidarity. It also brings me dangerously close to the precipice of my time on this agenda. But here we are. I don't have a recipe, a roadmap, or even, God forbid, a checklist for building solidarity. Nor can I, in conscience, just wrap it up with an artful metaphor of everyone singing together in a chorus. This project is far too urgent, and of far greater substance than can be rendered with a rhetorical flourish. So I don't have the answer, but I will offer into the mix one possible unifying thread that strikes me as weaving through, or if you are still drawn to that choir metaphor, then harmonizing our multiple justice endeavors. That thread for me centers on the notion of grievable lives. The phrase comes from an essay by the American feminist philosopher Judith Butler. Butler writes, and I quote in part, "To demand that every life be grievable is another way of saying that all lives ought to be able to persist in their living without being subject to violence, systemic abandonment, or obliteration, end quote. To me, the concept of grievable life is large enough to fit both human and non-human beings, and sufficiently robust to honor both precarious life and lives already lost. It strikes me that it evokes our deepest humanity without condoning species dominance. There are grievable lives, after all, in old-growth forests, just as there were grievable lives in residential schools and on the turbulent waters of migrant crossing routes. Grievability abides no hierarchy or relative ranking. It is premised on the interdependence of all life, and rejects the tropes of mitigation that infect much of our political discourse. Life is no less grievable when overlaid with stereotypes of criminality, vagrancy, or grievous and irremediable disability. So I leave you with a question, not an answer. Is there something here in this notion of grievable lives that calls to us, to all of us? Is there a portal of solidarity here that might take us together beyond the original vision of our human rights charters toward a project of radical social and political transformation? Certainly not in and of itself, I realize, but is it perhaps something to start with? A motif, perhaps? I give the final word here to Butler, who writes with elegant simplicity that in order to stand a chance of persisting, we must affirm, each of us to the other, that you are grievable to me. The loss of you is intolerable, and I want you to live. I'm down with that. What about you?